The Fed is trapped and at the worst possible time. I'm your host, Steven Van Metre, and thanks for joining me today. And with the global economy on the edge of a recession, the last thing the Fed should do is raise rates. But as you're about to see, the Fed is trapped. Let's head over to the Wall Street Journal, where we headline with the Fed's preferred gauge inflation measure reaches the fastest pace since 1983 as core personal consumption expenditures index climbed 5.2% in January from a year ago. The Commerce Department's personal consumption expenditures index of core inflation, which excludes volatile food and energy costs, rose 5.2% in January from a year earlier, up 4.9% in December. That marks the sharpest 12-month increase since April 1983. And on a monthly basis, the core PC price index climbed a seasonally adjusted 0.5% in January from the month prior, the same pace as the previous 3 months, showing no signs of slowdown. And the continued pickup in core prices adds to the pressure on Fed officials to begin raising interest rates this spring to cool the economy and bring down inflation, according to Veronica Clark, an economist at Citigroup. The consistent trend of even higher inflation could keep the Fed pursuing much tighter monetary policy in the months to come, with the next meeting slated for March 15th and 16th. And that is the problem right now, is the Fed may be forced to raise rates. And I want to show you why. They don't want to, but let's continue on with the story, because here we see personal consumption expenditures, again, the Fed's preferred gauge of inflation in blue, and the federal funds rate. In fact, I had to cut off the end, and I'll show you here in a moment, but I wanted you to see throughout history that when the PCE is rising on a year-over-year basis, the Fed plays catch-up with the federal funds rate, and there's times when it's off, and then it shoots way higher as the Fed, again, plays catch-up, and we can see that throughout history. But here recently, we have this problem is the PCE is running off the charts, and guess what? The federal funds rate, as you know, is at zero, and boy, that's the wrong place for the Fed to be at the wrong time. But perhaps they need to be there, and they know it. But let's continue on. The Friday's data comes off the heels of 4-decade high inflation readings from the Labor Department earlier this month. In January, the Consumer Price Index soared 7.5% from a year earlier, with core CPI up 6%. Producers' prices climbed 9.7% on a 12-month basis last month. Since the core PCE index is mostly drawn from those two indices, the latest reading doesn't yield much new information about the inflation dynamic. All it tells us is it's hot. The Labor Department's CPI typically runs higher than the Commerce's index, in part because they capture different pools of spending. The CPI measures changes in living costs based on what urban consumers pay out of pocket for a hypothetical basket of goods and services, whereas the PCE index, by contrast, includes prices in rural areas as well as those paid by organizations that spent on behalf of households, for example, including employer-sponsored health plans. And the part of the bigger issue here is headlines like these tell us that, yes, there is a major global conflict going on between Russia and Ukraine right now, and that is very unsettling for the global economy. And many people believe that this would be an appropriate time for the Fed to back off their plans to tighten and actually perhaps take a more moderate pace in case the global economy tips into a recession, which is highly probable, as we talked about in yesterday's show, as it is. But the issue is one of demand, and the Fed thinks demand is too high and supply is too low. And that is the issue, is not what people think. It's the simple factor of supply is less than demand. And so what I want you to think about here is, during this global conflict, what is likely to happen to supply? Is it likely to increase or further decrease, perhaps as supply chains are even put to a further test as things get worse? Well, that's the bigger issue here, is supply is likely to get worse. So what the Fed needs to do is curb demand, and that's what they're good at, and they do that through raising policy rates. Now let's continue on with this story, because there's a strong amount of evidence suggesting, well, the Fed's right. Let's take a look. The U.S. consumer spending tops forecasts even as inflation jumps, according to Bloomberg, as goods spending far outpaces services amid the Omicron wave. Purchase of goods and services adjusted for inflation increased 1.5% from December, the most in 10 months, according to Commerce figures on Friday, suggesting, just as the Fed knows, is higher prices aren't slowing demand down. And the data says that people are out spending. Even worse, they're drawing down in their savings to do it. As we see, the personal savings rate fell to an 8-year low in January as child tax credits lapsed and spending was strong. So despite the lack of the child tax credit, people are still spending. But we see the savings rate, the amount of money out of their checks that people are saving, draw down, but it's not having any slowdown in spending. And that's the key issue here. Demand remains strong, supply likely to get weaker. So what does the Fed have to do? Well, you've got it. They've got to tighten. And the latest hot inflation print further validates Fed officials' calls to begin raising interest rates at their March policy meeting. It could potentially lend support to a 0.5 percentage point hike, rather than a 0.25%. However, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is poised to worsen the inflationary picture, has injected uncertainty into the global economic outlook. And there's no doubt that that is causing uncertainty. But if there's one thing you shouldn't have uncertainty about, and that's your portfolio and what it could mean in a recession. If you haven't checked it out, be sure to check out Portfolio Shield. There's a link in the corner in the description below. You'll be glad you did. Let's continue on with the story, because a separate report Friday showed that orders placed with the U.S. factories for business equipment rose in January, further validating the demand issue by the most in 4 months, exceeding forecasts and consistent with resilient capital spending and pointing to a steady manufacturing growth. And here you can see manufacturers' new orders in durable goods are just skyrocketing higher, showing the demand is strong. But wait a second. What about the consumer in this picture? Well, check this out, because the consumer is telling a whole different story. When we overlay the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey, what I want you to notice here in red is sentiment heads lower at a point even when new orders are still rising. So where manufacturers and wholesalers still believe there's demand, and you can see rising here in the early 2000s as sentiment was falling. Same thing happened going into the great financial crisis. Sentiment was tumbling, and yet, according to the economy, the economic data, demand was still strong. Well, look now, sentiment is almost down to where it was at the bottom of the great financial crisis. It's worse than it was during the pandemic. And here you see durable goods new orders heading higher. But which one is the Fed going to look at? That's right. They're going to look at the economic data, not a survey. And what they're seeing is demand, demand, demand. And what they need to do is curb it, because there just isn't enough supply to meet it all. Let's continue on, because meantime, personal income stagnated in January. So all this happened at a point where incomes were flat. And as the monthly child tax credit payments offset a 0.5% advance in wages and salaries, the program gave millions of families up to $300 per child each month. And of course, there you go, that people are indeed spending down their savings to afford higher prices, and there's no slowdown. But why is the Fed trapped here? Is it simple a story of there's too much demand and not enough supply? Well, it's the timing of it. And it doesn't just have to deal with the Russia-Ukraine issue. It has to deal with the underlying setup of the economy. And what I want to show you in this next chart is something the Fed has never done. They've never started a tightening cycle when the situation is this bad. Check this out. Here we have real disposable personal income, or inflation adjusted disposable personal income, and red, the federal funds rate. And you'll notice that when the Fed enters a tightening cycle, and I didn't do any coloring just so we could look at it, real disposable personal incomes are running somewhere around a 3.5% to 5% rate. As of now, the first time in history, and not only the first time in this data series, it is at a nearly negative 10% year over year. So inflation adjusted disposable personal income is a negative 10% year over year. And the Fed's about to tighten. Do you know how often the Fed tightens when real disposable personal income is negative? None. Never have they ever done it in history. And what does that suggest? The probabilities that it isn't just a story about too much demand. This is a story that demand's going away and the Fed's about to tighten. And that tells us the probabilities of entering a recession at the hand of the Fed now are extremely high. And now you know why the Fed is trapped into doing this when they really actually shouldn't. And with that, I'm Steve Van Metre. Thanks for watching. Bye now. The content of this video is provides educational information. It's not intended to provide investment advice. You don't have to be construed as recognition or solicitation by selling security, financial instrument, or participate in any particular trading strategy. This video was prepared by Steven Van Metre. Personal capacity. Opinions expressed in this video that do not affect you as financial advising or Steven Van Metre Financial.